Good morning to both our in-person audience here at 1701 Pennsylvania and those joining us online. My name is Andrew Metrick, and I'm a former fellow here in the defense program. And over the past year, I had the distinct privilege and honor of leading the Defense Technology Task Force as the executive director. The Defense Technology Task Force was stood up in October 2023 and concluded in summer 2024, and it really sought to explore how the Department of Defense can effectively deliver capabilities at both speed and scale, largely with the tools and authorities that we have on the books today. And in that effort, I was aided and guided by the three august individuals we have here, who were really, great partners on that journey. I'm sure none of them need any introduction, but briefly, first, Mike Brown, who's the former director of the Defense Innovation Unit and a current partner at Shield Capital. He's a visiting scholar at the Stanford's Hoover Institute. And at DIU, he was really responsible for a key phase in the evolution of that organization. Second, Ellen Lord, who served as the inaugural Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, where she oversaw a comprehensive redesign of the DoD 5000 series. If you're familiar with the software acquisition pathway, Ellen played a key role in that. And most recently, she was a vice chair of the PPBE Commission, which I'm sure will come up at several points during this conversation. And before that, she had a 30-year career in defense industry. And finally, on the end is Bob Work, who's the former Deputy Secretary of Defense. He's a distinguished fellow, distinguished senior fellow here for Defense and National Security at the Center for New American Security. And as a former deputy secretary, he oversaw the department's various functions and probably is best known for the third offset strategy. And so as a sort of overview of the report and our findings, really what the group coalesced around was a series of seven factors, seven things that needed to be present in order for us to achieve success in sort of this capability delivery process. I just want to quickly provide an overview of those before I dive into our conversation today. But I want to sort of put that on a foundation on top of talent. Because in the conversations between the tri-chairs, the members of the task force, the thing that kept coming up over and over again was the importance of talent. None of the things that we're going to talk about are possible unless you have the right people in the right places at the right time. So with that, sort of the things that we thought and found were most important in success, where it begins with sort of senior leader support, the ability of that senior leader to sort of grease the skids. We then started to talk about needing a defined problem statement, which is different than a requirement because it allows flexibility. That flexibility is then in turn is part of what the empowered program team, that group of individuals on the front line, are sort of able to use and do. And they use that together, the problem statement and the program team supported by the senior leader, to go through an iterative process. And that's something else we'll talk about, is the value of iteration in delivering capabilities to the warfighter and how that achieves a better outcome. There's a thing we'll also probably talk about, because it's a little bit of a new phrase, is the idea of acquisition tradecraft, of repeatable processes, things that can be done over and over and over again, but can also be done at scale. They're not sort of one-off bespoke activities. It's a thing that is repeatable. There's obviously, and then at the end of the day, you need a transition partner. You need someone who this program team can work with to actually put something in the field, and that needs to then be supported by consistent funding. And that's the part where we start to talk about Congress and their role in supporting capability development and delivery across the department. So with that as a sort of overview for what we did and what we found, the first question I have is really to Ellen. So Ellen, based on your experiences as a senior leader in both inside and outside of government, I was hoping that you could help us better understand why the report continually goes back to the importance of senior leader support in getting innovation done and over the finish line in the department.
Great. Thank you, Metrick. And I'd like to say thank you to everybody at CNAS that made this report, the whole study, come to life, because I think convening both government and industry, academia, is really important, and there's a unique position that think tanks have that they can convene. So it was a great effort. So why do we need senior leadership? for innovation particularly. I believe it's because DoD is a very large, complex organization with emerging threats popping up globally all the time, new technology being developed, an enormous remit that the whole department has in terms of working with allies and partners, answering to all the stakeholders, whether it be Congress, the White House. And so somehow what happens is things get a little diluted when you're going from the national defense strategy to the actual appropriations and then saying, how do we deliver this capability that is strategically important? So with all these different people with different demand signals, senior leaders, the SecDef, the DepSecDef, the unders, all the key individuals need to pick a few critical issues that they are going to make their own, and they need to echo and amplify what those issues are, what the problem is, and then what success looks like. But it's not sufficient just to do that one time. I think in any large organization, if you have initiatives, you as a leader have to clearly define, articulate the problem, say why it's relevant, and then there has to be one human being who's responsible for delivering on that, and there have to be specific dates with deliverables due, and there has to be a scorecard with actual metrics to be able to quantify what's being done. Now, we've seen in the department that we've been able to implement, I say we, I'm not in the department anymore, the Department of Defense has been very good in small verticals, whether it be the Rapid Capabilities Office, other groups, DIU, because they have senior leader attention and they get the forum so that decisions can be made. With not every person, every PEO, and the PEOs are really the ones who are delivering here, can get that senior leader time. So they need to be hearing at a regular cadence from leaders what's important so that they can go and in turn lead and be effective.
Thanks, Ellen. That's really helpful for sort of framing, I think, one of the key overarching, what I'll call like superstructures that enable us to get to a better place when it comes to getting capabilities to the field faster and at greater scale. But Mike, I want to pivot to you for a second, and sort of as the DIU director, one of the factors that arose from our conversations was this idea of acquisition tradecraft. And I think that really came out of the CSO process that DIU has established and has had some pretty good successes on, especially in that sort of speed to contract space. So can you help us understand why these sort of repeatable, rapid processes are so important? Especially for, I think when the department thinks about the world, oftentimes they think about, or the more monolithic parts of the department think about big contractors. But why is that important for smaller companies? I know as someone who lives in the VC space now, can you help us sort of understand the differences from an industrial perspective of why these processes matter?
Well, a lot in that question, Metrick. Before I answer, let me also thank CNAS and say it was such a privilege to work with two people I respect as much as Ellen and Bob. So thank you for serving on the task force as well. And Metrick really deserves a credit for putting all of the material that we heard over a year into one report. So thanks for the great job you did on that. Okay, acquisition tradecraft. Actually, tip of the hat to Josh Marcuse, who's here with us, who really highlighted that in the discussions that we had. I think that really is getting at having the right tool for the job. So we don't need to use the FAR for everything. So let's not use it for everything. Ellen did a particularly impressive job leading A&S, coming up with the different pathways for acquisition. You know, as we get middle tier acquisition, we talked about software pathways. There are different ways to go about bringing in capability, and we should use the right tool for the job. So that's one important concept of acquisition tradecraft. The other is what you touched on, Metrick, which is repeatable process. We need to be able to do things that we are able to implement at scale and get more experience at. And some of the alternative pathways, like the CSO, it stands for Commercial Solutions Opening. I think someone before me at DIU invented that, and then we just rinsed and repeated on that. that was an enabling capability for us to be able to scan what was happening competitively and bring in many non-traditional vendors and put them in a process where they could start being a vendor to DoD. I'm proud that DIU has introduced at least 100 new vendors into DoD of the non-traditional type. So again, what we're talking about here is capability that's maybe not so traditional, not new vendors for tanks, planes, and ships, but most of the things that the department needs now, not from a dollar standpoint, but from a capability standpoint, are things being developed in the commercial world. So here it's particularly important to make sure you got the right tool for the job. So the commercial solutions opening, if we had a quick seminar on that, would basically mirror what happens in the commercial world. How do we see the vendors that are out there using one of the recommendations that we made? Defining the problem, not the requirement, allows you to get much more creative input on how I might skin this cat. I don't need to tell the vendor exactly what they're going to be doing. Maybe they can help me think about the problem differently. Then bringing in a wider set of vendors, which makes it a more competitive process, actually testing them in a military application. Some of the commercial tech falls out there, about 25%, but the rest means you can go on and develop that through iteration and get the right capability for the warfighter. The other great thing about using CSO, which leverages the other transaction authority, is I can go straight into production once I've tested that capability in a prototype OT. So that's one of the techniques that DIU used to bring in more vendors more quickly and be able to get capability of the warfighter faster.
I think it's important, building on that, people might not realize that the Defense Logistics Agency during COVID used CSOs really, really effectively to go out and get PPE, all kinds of different things. So that was wonderful to have that scale quickly.
And you'd have to say that's probably one of the most successful acquisition programs DoD has ever been involved with, right? I mean, pretty phenomenal.
Scope and scale was amazing.
For the country.
One of the things also that sort of I think is implicit, Mike, in what you were talking about is something where we'll get to a little later, but sort of the role of software. And as what we're increasingly seeing is that capabilities are increasingly defined by the software that they use. And so having these problem statements and processes that allow for development and changes in that software really provide a different type of capability development process than saying needing to go out and buy a new aircraft or cut a new hole in a ship to mount a new thing. You're changing that sort of cycle of innovation and that cycle of evolution from a capability perspective. And that's a little bit different spin on the ball than I think the way that the department has historically thought about, all right, we need to upgrade, modernize, change, whatever, a given system. But lastly, I want to turn to Bob. And during your tenure as deputy, you had a signature initiative, the third offset. And part of this is about transition partners. It's about going from having a core set of people who are pushing forward a set of capabilities and technologies and transitioning that to the wider force, and the role of Congressness and funding stability. So can you sort of talk us through the importance of getting transition partners, but then also getting that buy-in from the Hill to sort of have those programs have a longevity that they otherwise might not have?
Sure. And I'd like to echo my fellow panelists in thanking you all for being here this morning and all of the people who are watching online. And Andrew's job as the executive director was just unbelievable. The report is in the shape that it's in primarily through his personal, work. I want to say there's this meme that the Department of Defense is this huge behemoth, a bumbling, stumbling, sluggish organization. And it is wrong. If you take a look at the Department of Defense since the end of World War II, I would argue that it is the most innovative organization in the United States, commercial or government. We can go through all of the evidence to support this, but you're not going to find too many different organizations that go from propeller to jets, jets to long-range aviation, air-to-air refueling, high-altitude spy aircraft, then into space, then into guided munitions, then into ICBMs. I mean, it's just one after the other, these tremendous innovations and capabilities. And I would put it up against Google and Apple and everybody else. Now, the third offset strategy was not a program. It wasn't about things. It was a competitive strategy to maintain military technical superiority over our adversaries. That's what it was about. A lot of people don't remember, but if you go back and read the initiating document by Secretary of Defense Hagel, he established the Advanced Capabilities and Deterrence Panel. And he said, work, you're going to run this with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Although not explicitly said, what that did was it said, DepSecDef and Vice Chairman, you are responsible for overseeing the innovation activities of the department. And if you just review what Kath Hicks has done as Deputy Secretary, you will see that that has continued to this day and will continue in the future. And it gets right to the senior leader kind of, you have to have somebody doing top-down push when you're trying to change the orientation of the department after over a decade and a half of fighting in the desert. And if you take a look at all of the things that have happened since 2014, there's no doubt in my mind that future OSD historians, there will be a book in the OSD historical books that will take a look from 2014, when the Defense Innovation Initiative was announced, to 2024 as one of the most innovative times in the Department of Defense history. And all you got to do is look at all of the things that have happened since 2014. The list is stunning. And you just have to think of it, you know, Secretary Hagel said, we have to be more innovative. I mean, we're kind of stuck in thinking about the desert and putting warheads on foreheads. We now have to think about our great power rivals. And you're not going to be able to compete with them if we still do the same old, same old. We got to change across the department. And if you take a look at that, what the department had to do is build the skeleton to support the weight of all the innovation, and then the musculature to allow you to move forward. And so you just take a look, you know, Jake, DIU, CDO, Chief Data Officer, CDAO, Chief Digital and AI Officer, OSC, the Office of Strategic Capital, GUIDE, Global Integration. It's an experiment for, it's an iterative experiment for JAD, C2, Joint and Combined, All Domain Command and Control. It's overseen by the Undersecretary of Defense for NRE, and she monitors 90-day sprints. Today in 2024, we're on Guide 11. That's how many experiments we have done to try to figure out how are you going to make CJ, you know what I'm talking about, CJAT C2. So, like I said, a lot of people don't give the Defense Department the credit I think that it deserves. So, again, the third offset wasn't about things. It said, for us to maintain military technical superiority, we must dominate in autonomous systems. That was the stated goal of the strategy. And if you just take a look at all of the things that the department has done, if you want good autonomous systems, you have to have good AI. You start with the AI, you start with the data, then you get the cloud. You know, you just start doing all of these things to move you forward, and now you're just, the amount of activity that's going on in the department in autonomous systems is eye-watering. So I don't have anything in terms of transition partners. I think what the third offset does is it shows the importance of the first factor, senior leader involvement and personal oversight.
No, I think that's a really good point and thing to remember, because over the course, this task force was occurring as the department was, and the DepSecDef was talking about Replicator and talking about it in a different way. And one of the things that was perceptive, at least to me, was that Replicator, there became a very strong undercurrent that Replicator was less about the capabilities, not saying the capabilities weren't important, but it was more about the process. And it was more about creating processes, Bob, like you were sort of outlining, that could do innovation and do things differently and do them differently at scale. And that was one of the reasons why the last recommendation in the report, which is kind of admittedly broad, because we wanted it to be broadly applicable, was simply a exhortation to do more and do more at scale, with the belief that we are at that sort of boulder rolling down the hill stage where we are beginning to pick up speed. And you see this in the department at certain points in history where the department picks up speed and things start to happen much more quickly.
But Andrew, I'm sorry. There's one thing I wanted to say, which I forgot to do so. The DII, the Defense Innovation Initiative, was about operational innovation, new operational concepts, distributed maritime operations, agile combat employment in the Air Force. The Marine Corps stand-in forces. These were operational innovations which would allow us to compete against any adversary. When Secretary Carter came in, he said, you have forgotten one key aspect. We've got to bring on the venture capital community. We've got to bring on Silicon Valley. He set up the DIU. He established the Defense Innovation Board. And the innovation that we talk about in this is how do you get that type of innovation rapidly at scale into the department. They are complementary, but they are not the same. So a lot of times when you talk to people about innovation, you have to say, what type of innovation are you talking about? And the Air Force officers might say, well, I want to talk about agile combat employment. How do we keep airfields going in a contested environment? How is the fleet going to operate widely dispersed? So they'll be talking about that, and that goes slower. Talk about a valley of death. It is a desert of death because you have to get all of the warfighters bought in to the new operational concepts. And that is why when you talk about revolutions in war, the point that you know that the revolution is taking hold is when the military services start writing new concepts of operation into their doctrine, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Once that happens, it's a self-banning wildfire. And I would argue you see that now. I don't think the Army has published its Army warfighting concept yet, officially. But I saw early parts of it, and it is, oh wow, okay. The first unit that meets the enemy is going to be robotic or unmanned. That is what the Army is shooting towards. So as I said, when you go from, okay, we want to dominate in autonomy, and you get down to 2024 and the services, Maven Smart System, Task Force 59, all of these things, you say, okay, we're cooking with gas.
I think you bring up a really great point about innovation, Bob, in that there are many different dimensions of innovation. At DoD, we always talk about technological innovation, and there's been an incredible amount done. But I think what we were looking at in this report are things like business system innovation when we talk about acquisition, tradecraft, and so forth. So I can't help but give a shout out here for the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution Commission report, because it really focused on the same idea of business system innovation. And I don't think we're going to be successful in the delivering capability to the warfighter unless we do have that business system innovation as well.
Mike, I know you also wanted to.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on completely agree with Ellen, as I find myself usually doing.
We talk.
But I want to pick up on a thread that Bob was alluding to, which is the innovation that the report refers to is really how do we get capability of the warfighter? And that really is mission-driven. So one of the things I learned in my time leading DIU was push versus pull. If you think you're going to push innovation because you have some whizzy new thing from Silicon Valley or elsewhere, you're wasting your time. It's got to be grounded in a real problem that warfighters are struggling with. That's when you get the senior leader attention. That's when you get the budget behind it. It's that pull, which is the transition partner, that really helps you scale innovation, because now I've got a real need. I got senior leader attention. I got end users or warfighters who are pulling forward, who are willing to experiment with it, help you go through a vendor selection process. Those are the things that have to come together for you to have critical mass to get innovation moved forward. It's got to be that pull from warfighters on a real problem.
So this warfighter pull question, I think, leads well into sort of the next thing I wanted to pose to the three of you. And it's this idea about iteration. And it's something that the Air Force and the Navy and others and the Army as well has talked about as including the warfighter in a lot of these innovation discussions from the beginning and these capability development processes from the beginning. So recently, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Andrew Hunter, made this exact point about how the Air Force avoided some pitfalls in some of its OIs by having warfighters in the process early. And so it's clearly, Bob, to your point, it's clearly a thing that is happening, but we probably don't see it as much as we would like across the department. So what do the three of you think needs to happen to have that sort of be the way we do business writ large across the department? What's sort of holding us back from being more iterative?
I think there are a couple of things. One, it's culture, where other than if you're special operations, failing and failing fast is typically not a good thing. There are a lot of antibodies that come out. You have to be perfect, may as well be 3 years late and meet the requirements that were set up 20 years ago versus field something quickly and have it be a little messy. So I think it comes back to looking at commercial software coding, for instance, where you've got this cadence where you're developing, producing, sustaining, testing, all on a daily basis. And frankly, I think we need leadership within the department to understand that and be smart buyers and leverage the commercial community more to do that. We have a little bit of a syndrome of, oh, it needs to be developed in the department. And particularly for software, that I don't think is going to work because most of our systems, as we know, today are hardware enabled, and that hardware is going to be around for decades, and you do need often a deliberative process for that, but not always. But they're software defined, and that software you need to be upgrading on a daily basis. So I think, again, this is where the voice of the customer, those downrange using it, COCOMs, I think, are getting more of a voice these days. That's a good thing to be ready to fight tonight. But we need senior leaders in the department to acknowledge that and also move quickly and emphasize some of the programs like you were talking about, Bob.
So I would say this is even a broader concept that the commercial world has figured out decades ago. It's really an agile development process versus a waterfall. The waterfall process is much like what the department has used for years. It assumes that if we spend longer in a room planning and develop a rigid process, that we'll come out with a better answer. And the world's changing too fast for that. That's why the commercial world assumes there's uncertainty and figures out how to move at a faster cycle. Ukraine is showing this right now in the drone warfare. So the more we can think about, as Andrew Hunter has called for, how do we adopt agile methods, which are iteration and getting end user or warfighter feedback up front and throughout the process, the better we're going to be able to develop solutions that actually can be used faster, more effectively, and frankly is going to bring in a wider set of vendors who can provide that.
And you can see this. I mean, there's a lot of this iterative process going on now. The guide, as I said, we're on guide 11. At the beginning, they said there's no way we're going to tackle combined, joint, all-domain command and control in one leap. You're going to have to figure this out. You're going to figure out all the connections. You got to figure out the data layer. You got to figure out the transportation layer. And you got to experiment on each of those iteratively. I think the Space Development Agency is another example of iterative development. Their tranches of satellites in their low Earth orbiting proliferated architecture, just tranche 1, tranche 2, tranche 3. Mike or Andrew mentioned the Air Force is really adopting this type of thinking in their acquisition. It's happening. It's just, as Andrew said, none of the people in this room probably think it's happening fast enough. And I don't think any of us think it's happening fast enough. But in the big scheme of things in the Department of Defense, my good friend Peter Levine, who's here today, he said something to me that really stuck with me. And he said, look, the Department of Defense, a lot of people think about the Department of Defense as a business, the biggest business in the world. He says, the Department of Defense isn't a business, it's an economy. It has its own real estate agent. It has its own healthcare agency. It has its own, you name it. And so you just can't have one person at the top of the U.S. economy and saying, okay, we're going to solve inflation today by doing this. Boom. It's just a lot of little activities that are going on from some type of a guiding hand. So I actually think we're on the right path on this iterative process, and I think it will accelerate as you see more and more successes.
So I also want to give a quick plug. For those that are watching online, there is an option for you to submit questions. I'm getting them here. In probably about 10 minutes, I'll start to fold some of those into the conversations, as well as bring in the audience here in the room. I have two sort of more broad questions for the three of you before we get there, though. First, the report, I think, it's a bit of a novel feature. It talks about some of the failure modes of like where things go wrong. Talks about issues of overclassification and balancing oversight with speed, and a myriad of other challenges that we often see in this space. So to the three of you, if you were a king or queen for a day, what is the failure mode that you think is most holding us back?
I'm going to start with it's the money. The money doesn't move fast enough to recognize the threat and leverage technology. So hats off to Ellen and the PPB&E Commission. We need to implement those things yesterday. That is, in my mind, the single biggest inhibitor to national security is not having a budgeting process that moves with the speed and agility and flexibility to give senior leaders in the department the flexibility to move where they see the need is.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And building on those comments a little bit, Mike, I think we all need to remember it's the program executive officers, the PEOs, who are really getting things done in the building. And they have their hands tied a lot of the time. And a lot of it comes down to colors of money, or 1-year money versus 2-year money versus 3-year money. So there's been an enormous amount of discussion in many different forums, the PPB&E Commission being one of them, about having broader definitions for budget line items, because the world changes quickly around us, and PEOs are closest to knowing what the capabilities are that industry has out there, what their teams can execute on, what the test and evaluation programs look like, what the warfighter needs today, because they hear about that. We need to not constrain them to such a degree with very narrow budget lines that are difficult to move around. Now, obviously, appropriators have requirements on them to guard taxpayer dollars, and they have to have accountability. I think somewhere in the middle, we can work between appropriators on the Hill and between those in the building to make sure we have the guardrails out there to allow PEOs to move forward more quickly, because most people have a lot of ideas about what they would do to achieve their objectives a lot faster if only they broke down some of those silos with funding. So it's all about the money.
I totally agree, and I'd go as far to say that the biggest impediment to the type of innovation that we're talking about, rapid grabbing new capabilities in the commercial sector and rapidly pushing it in at scale is the continuing resolution. That one thing right there,
Ouch.
you can't have any new starts. So if someone comes in and says, I have a goncalator that will completely solve the combined joint all-domain command and control problem, I'll demonstrate it for you. I can prove it. Well, it's a new start. So you got to wait next year. And there are just so many examples. You can't spend more money than you spent last year. Well, what happens if you have 4 or 5 algorithms that you can insert into a program of record that will make that program of record that much more effective and lethal? Nope, can't do that because it would cost more money than you spent last year. So the continuing resolution, and what makes it bad is I think in the last 9 years, we've been in a continuing resolution like 40 or 50% of the time. So I think Congress really needs to take a look at that. Well, what they have to do is say, hey, we're failing at our job. And I don't think that's going to happen. But wow, the continuing resolution is really a problem.
We should start calling it General Secretary Xi's continuing resolution, because it's a gift to him each year that we give him.
I think we could probably, the laundry list of things that we would like out of Congress, I think begins with the CR, but does, with the end of the CR, but does not stop there. But we sort of ended up with this report in a set of recommendations that were, quite broad. There are some more specifics in the appendices, but one of the reasons for that was we wanted this to be applicable for as many DoD organizations as possible. And so they're thematic, but I wanted to ask the three of you, if you had to go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice about what to do differently before you went into government, with the knowledge that there are probably folks watching this who will see this afterwards, who come January will be entering the administration, regardless of which way the election turns. So what would you tell yourself, knowing that it might fall onto someone who's heading in for the first time in a few months?
I think it's very important, particularly in leadership positions, to pick 2 or 3 things that you are going to really focus on and get done. And that requires that you be comfortable delegating to your team. You can delegate, but you need to make sure there are metrics there to measure what's being done to assure it. I think as you're executing on your 2 or 3 initiatives, you have to realize this is a very complex ecosystem, and no one person in DC gets anything done. So there are a lot of stakeholders, and you better learn how to work within DoD, throughout the executive branch, and also with the Hill. And you can't confuse activity with progress. It's really easy to have a whole lot of activity and not move anything one iota. So it's also very easy within a highly regulated ecosystem, such as defense, to spend your entire life on compliance and checking all the boxes. I really urge everyone to use what I call creative compliance. We're not all pilots when you're sitting in the building. We need to check just enough boxes on that checklist to make sure that we are being compliant with regulations, but we need to be creative about how to move the ball forward. And I think that's a lot about what this report talked about. It wasn't asking for a lot of new authorities, a lot of new policies, new implementation guidance. It was saying, look at what's there, learn from the past, and move forward crisply.
I wish I had the benefit of some of Ellen's advice when I started. I've never worked in a more difficult place to get things done, but more rewarding, more important mission. So I would say to anyone coming in, especially if you're coming in from the private sector, as Ellen and I did, that
strangers in a strange land.
As you're learning about colors of money and budgeting cycles, continue to bring the passion. You're going to need it to overcome the obstacles to get your 2 or 3 things done. And you're going to be disappointed, so set your expectations. But over the long term, the arc is moving in the right direction, which is what Bob talked about. If you look over a longer period of time, the things that you might have thought were important and were quite vocal about, even though you might have been shut down as you were saying them, they start to happen. And that's very, very gratifying to see that we're moving in the right direction. But it's not going to happen quickly, and it's not going to happen without allies, as Ellen said, across the government.
I think you made a good point. It takes a bit of resilience, so you can't let it get you down, you know?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would tell my younger self is what Peter said. You know, the Department of Defense is an economy. It is ginormous. There is no other organization in the world that has the span of activities and just the sheer size of the Department of Defense. So don't expect to go as fast as you were taught in the Wharton Business School. You know, it won't go that fast. You have to be patient. You have to be ready for setbacks. You have to, you know, just keep pushing forward, pushing forward. I like Ellen's word, resilience. The second thing I like what Ellen said, priorities. Pick 2 or 3 things that you're going to focus on and focus on them ruthlessly. Those are the things. Not everything doing well, everything doing is worth doing well. I was told this as a young midshipman. And first I said, what the hell does that mean? And what the speaker said was, look, you're going to have all these activities. You've got to do voting. You know, you've got to get your people to worry about voting. You've got to get your people to worry about DEI. You've got to get your people worried about sexual assault. All of these things, and you just can't be 100% on all those things. And it goes back to the prioritization of what you're going to do. Delegate and give credit to the people who really work it and really get things done. The Drew Kukors, the Jack Shanahans. You know, these are the unsung heroes of the Department of Defense. The Randy Waldens. You know, people who, Will Ropers, people who really embrace change and innovation and what you go after. Yeah, so.
Great. I think that serves as a pretty good corpus for those who are coming in a few months to what to think about, especially who might be stepping into some of those senior leader slots and have to really grapple with the scale of the department, grapple with the reality of the timelines within the department, and to sort of build that resilience to get things done.
I forgot one thing that I think is real important. We talk about it about multilingual capability. You have to know the technology. You have to know the operational need and what you're trying to solve. And you have to know acquisition tradecraft. So if you aren't comfortable in all 3 of those things, you need to make yourself comfortable. You need to study, you need to work, and you need to find the people who are multilingual, like the Drew Kukors. And there's a whole bunch of people down in Army 18th Airborne Corps that are working on the Maven Smart system. And those are the same type of people. They know it all. They know how to contract. They know what they're trying to solve, the sensor to shooter. You know, let's shorten that up and get better targeting. And they know the technology. They know, hey, this is what AI can really do for you. So that would be the other thing that I would do if you join the department.
I also want to foot stomp what Bob said from the research that the CNAS team conducted. That shown through time and time again is that a lot of these successful efforts were built by what I'll call unicorn individuals, the Drew Kukors of the world, the Jack Shanahans of the world, who knew almost every part of their portfolio and every aspect of it. And so if you are going into that senior leadership role, find those people and put them at the nucleus of that empowered program team, and then give them the tools to succeed. Because that is where we saw from our research the times where things began to accelerate, is that when you put those people in positions where they could achieve what they wanted. And so, you know, Bob mentioned Jake, which is now, you know, morphed into CDAO, but you saw that piece there. You saw an empowered group of people who had some of those unicorns who were given the space and time to run. Knowing that we're getting up on time, I want to sort of draw on a question from our virtual audience between turning to you all in the room. So if you have questions, begin to think about them. When we get to that point, Phil's in the back. Raise your hand. Please introduce yourself, where you're coming from, and then state your question. But from our, can combine a question from Chelsea and Will from the virtual side to sort of ask about what can we learn from Ukraine and the Ukrainian sets of examples, but then probably most importantly, given the way the U.S. talks about our strategy, how can we take what we're learning from Ukraine and then also inject it and work more closely with our allies and partners? Because part of this isn't just about building capabilities that we have ourselves, it's about building capabilities in that collective of like-minded nations. So I don't know which one of you wants to take your first crack at that. I know it's a bit of a big question, but please.
I'll make two quick comments. I think, one, Ukraine has shown us the criticality of taking commercial technology to the battlefield. So probably two easy examples are UAS as well as satellite imagery. If we didn't have commercial UAS and commercial satellite imagery, the Ukrainians would not be where they are today. But it isn't sufficient just to have that. It was the quick iteration like we were talking about in the report, and the fact that there are so many people from industry literally on the battlefield with those who are in uniform, fighting on the battlefield, working through new solutions. It's really shown us that the nature of warfare has changed.
Yeah, exactly the same 2 points. Commercial tech and how important that is, and we need to be fostering more of that, figuring out how to get more of it into the U.S. military. And that cycle time, the speed, is something we've really got to learn. That's something we typically have not had to react to in the same way, and we got to be really good at that if we're going to fight the next war.
When looking at Ukraine, again, you have to ask yourself, what type of innovation are you talking about? And Ukraine is a poster child for wartime innovation. And so before we compare DoD peacetime activities to Ukraine, I would say we need to compare U.S. wartime innovation to Ukraine wartime innovation. The example I like to use, I think, and Randy would be able to tell me, the GBU-28, which, here we are in the middle of war, and the CENTCOM commander comes in and says, I can't get to the leadership. They're 40 feet underground. I don't have any weapon that can touch them. And so in 28 days, we went from that kind of simple problem statement to getting a bomb dropped into the leadership bunkers of the Iraqi high command. And so, I mean, it was commercial, it was the Air Force Research Laboratory, it was warfighters. I mean, the other thing, all you got to do is go into a CAOC, a Combined Air Operations Center, and the targeting advances and innovations that go on are just unbelievable. How are we going to get a weapon into this particular target? And there's innovations going on by the second. You just have people come in and say, hey, we'll link this sensor with this shooter. We'll attack it vertically instead of horizontally, just stuff like that. So it just goes back to be sure you know what type of innovation you're talking about.
And Bob, I know you also have talked about guide and other experimentation efforts, and I think one of the reasons why stuff like that is so important is it gets you to some of this different type of innovation in a peacetime environment and can actually serve as an engine for some of the things that we've talked about here. But the important part, again, is the linkages from those activities to processes that let you go from, hey, we saw this great thing in an exercise, to how do we get that in the field? But so at this point, if there are any questions here in the room, I can keep going for a while. Sir, and then Josh.
General Tim Ray, retired President and CEO of Benz right now. I've benefited from advice and support from the two of you over my career, so thank you. I appreciate that over the years. Assuming the starting position of my question is I buy everything in here, so it's a yes if, not a no because. But as I bring in a broader what I would call national security industrial base, not a DIB, that has to play in this ecosystem. There's this really interesting dynamic, just watching what happened in Lebanon with pagers and radios blowing up, supply chain concerns, certainly the presence of our Chinese friends in our networks, et cetera. There's this balance of risk, right? So as we start talking about throwing new tech at this quickly, I mean, what advice would you give us about managing risk? You've got speed, and you can do things fast, but there's a certainty of who's on the network and components and whatnot. It's a much more present concern, I think, that we would have realized 5, 10 years ago. I think it's really up close and personal. What advice would you give those who think about this innovation space and going faster, and how we navigate that? Thanks.
I think one of the issues today that we have to think about up front is, to use a generic term, the cybersecurity of things. How can things be hacked? And also electronic warfare, because those early UASs in Ukraine were jammed pretty quickly. And so then it becomes a whole spectrum issue and managing the spectrum. So it's a balance of what I'll say hardening the commercial systems, and I'm not sure that we have the ecosystem set up right now to do that. And I think that's the kind of things that DIU focuses on, perhaps a little bit more than others, but I think we have to start having smarter buyers, and it's probably pretty controversial, but I think we should stop doing as much development within DoD, for instance, software factories and other things, outsource that, only do the development in DoD where it's nuclear, it's something that's not going to be done in industry, and take some of that traditional development workforce and dollars and focus it on hardening these commercial solutions and educating commercial industry, because there's no reason people in commercial industry are going to understand all of these failure mechanisms, if you will, and potentially unintended consequences. And I think the pagers and the cell phones, that's a great vignette to start with to show, what can go so very wrong.
I think part of it is also understanding the sort of that supply chain assurance and the supply chain risk pieces of it, because it's not something that really gets talked about enough, as well as sort of understanding that cradle to grave manufacturing process. There's, I think, a real need to have a hard look at the industrial base of America from that assurance perspective about, do we understand where things are coming from? Do we understand where we're taking risks? I think right now, oftentimes, we don't understand that. And then, are there mitigation technologies that we can apply at certain points? Because at some point, you're going to buy commodity stuff from commodity suppliers.
Yes, but I'll tell you what, Bob and I both work in this field a bit, and I think there's incredible technology out there in terms of AI, ML, to look at supply chains, understand beneficial ownership of companies, understand the webs of what's going on, third-party risk. And this is an area where the department in silos is doing very, very well. In fact, there are GSA contracts out there that anybody can MIPR money to, and I think some of the defense industrial base has been a little shocked at the data and information that's coming back to say, hey, 7 levels down, you thought it was Ellen's garage shop. Well, it's actually a little group in China. So I think we just need to echo and amplify that.
Yeah, you stole my thunder.
Sorry.
AI can really help this issue. I work with companies in which they have algorithms, applications that can go into the supply chain, tell you which suppliers are economically distressed and more prone to a adversarial capital type situation. They can identify the bottlenecks. They can identify how far down. Generally in the Department of Defense, if you can get down to the 2nd or 3rd tier, you're patting yourself on the back.
Yeah, and that's because of contract privacy. That's not because people are being lazy. Just legally, you can't get there. So that's why this is helpful.
But the AI can burrow down all the way to, as Ellen said, to the shop floor and the garage. And God, we have so many organizations and agencies, but I think we really have to think about a supply chain counterintelligence and security agency that does nothing but think about this 24/7 and goes out to the commercial companies and says, these are the algorithms that we need. We want to go after this problem in the supply chain. And
It's kind of a logical extension of CFIUS, where we were looking at countering foreign investment in the United States. Now it's countering, nefarious supply chain activity in the U.S.
But speaking as someone who lives in Silicon Valley, this is a problem that's known here in D.C., but in Silicon Valley, counterintelligence is something that happens back in Washington. So we have to do more education and provide the tools. Sounds like we're all three working with companies that provide the tools. We've got to make that more well-known, people to see this is what you need to be doing and make that easier, because it's not as well understood or well practiced.
This gets to a larger point that I think we tried to do in this study. We're really good at facts and figures and all these esoteric things. I don't think DoD is really good about telling stories so that the average American understands, without divulging confidential information, really what the threat is out there and how nefarious, frankly, our adversaries are. And it's not just about kinetic warfare. It's about our infrastructure being blown up or our bank accounts being emptied out and so forth. So that's a huge opportunity.
Nefarious and ingenious.
True,
Pretty sharp.
true.
Josh.
Thanks so much, Josh Marquez from Google Public Sector. What a privilege it was to collaborate with you on this. Congratulations on a fantastic report. One of the things that shows up in the conclusions that got a little bit less attention today is managing the careers of these unicorns and these trilingual leaders. And we met a lot of them in the research that we did, and all of them described the enormous amount of burden placed on them to use all of their languages. And they all felt like their careers were in jeopardy the whole time. If they're so essential, what can DoD do to protect them and preserve them and grow more of these mythical creatures and not have them feel like an endangered species?
I think we could take a lesson from the nuclear force where people stay in place for 6 to 8 years if you have critical assignments, especially the leaders. We tend to give a lot of experience to different people, which is great, but when you have someone who's really, really talented and contributing at an extraordinary level, there's nothing in the system that allows that individual to grow and do more of the same. They often end up with an assignment that they don't want, and then they deselect and leave the force. And that's the biggest problem I think we have, is people whose families say, I can't live with this anymore because I can't keep moving, or I don't want to move to XYZ spot and so forth. So it's a huge issue, Josh. I'm glad you brought it up.
yeah, there's all sorts of different levers that you can pull. You can create a manpower classification designator for people. But then you always have to identify billets within organizations that would need these people. Otherwise, they don't go anywhere.
You know what? Not everyone might understand, and this was a real learning moment for me when I came into the department. In business, you have money, you hire people. In government, it doesn't work out that way. You not only need the money to pay the people, but you need billets, and these billets are very constrained, and there's a bit of a food fight over them. So this is the issue that Bob's talking about.
And the other thing is you can write precepts on selection boards. And the precepts, the guidance on precepts can be very, very broad. But the person who convenes the selection boards can say, look, you need to promote the unicorns at the same rate, so in the Air Force, as fighter pilots, the standard fighter pilot, or in the Navy, the surface warfare officer, or, in the Army, a combat arms officer. So this is a tough, tough problem. In fact, it's one of the places where senior leaders play the most important role. I want that person. I would like you to move them over. I remember the first time that Eric Schmidt and I went to the Jake, and we got a brief, and 90% of the officers in the Jake were reserve officers. Now, this is I'm not casting aspersions on reserve officers. It's just that the department said, we want you to pick your best and brightest, the people who are fast movers in the promotion, who you think someday are going to be a colonel or a general. These are the type of people we need to put in this organization if we're going to have success. And the fact that almost everybody was reserve indicated to us that the services had not bought into the idea of the Jake, and they weren't willing to put their best and brightest into the Jake. So you're having senior people say, okay, I want to have Randy Walden on this particular project, or I need Will Roper moved over here, and I need him to solve a problem. But this is one of the things we're going to have to, and I'm doing the same thing. Ellen said, I'm not in the Department of Defense anymore, but this is one of the things the Department of Defense is going to have to grapple with. You know, how are you going to grow this talent?
Don't you think that's because there's a historical bias or tradition that it's all about command? So we're kind of training each person, no matter if they're a cyber specialist or a fantastic program manager. It's like what's valued is you're going to be, you know, Chief of the Air Force or the CNO.
So,
Yeah, I mean, that's
So we need to allow for a lot more career paths, the different designations, and place equal value on some of the other.
Well, industry
career paths.
went through this, right? So that's why
Right.
you have senior fellows and all these kinds of individual contributors that can, you know, continue to fleet up.
So as a recently recovering think tanker, it warms my heart that we have done the thing that every think tank study aims to do, which is suggest a topic for the next study, which is innovative personnel management, because I think that is really probably at the crux of the issue.
Target rich.
It is a target-rich environment. But I want to acknowledge that we're at time for today. Thank my panelists. Thank all of you, both here in person at 1701 Penn, as well as those who have joined us today virtually for a great conversation. Thank you much.
Thank you, Metrick.